Welcome back. Let's read one more.
Flood myth. The Deluge. Frontispiece to Gustave Dorés illustrated edition of the Bible. A flood myth or a deluge myth is a myth in which a great flood, usually sent by a deity or deities, destroys civilization, often in an act of divine retribution. Parallels are often drawn between the flood waters of these myths and the primeval waters which appear in certain creation myths, as the flood waters are described as a measure for the cleansing of humanity, in preparation for rebirth. Most flood myths also contain a culture hero, who represents the human craving for life. 1. The flood myth motif occurs in many cultures, including Thamanvantara Sandoye in Hinduism, Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek mythology, the Genesis flood narrative, the Mesopotamian flood stories, and the Cheyenne flood story. Mythologies. One example of a flood myth is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Many scholars believe that this account was copied from the Akkadian Atrahasis, which dates to the 18th century BCE. 3. B. In the Gilgamesh flood myth, the highest god, Enlil, decides to destroy the world with a flood because humans have become too noisy. The god Ea, who had created humans out of clay and divine blood, secretly warns the hero Utnapishtim of the impending flood and gives him detailed instructions for building a boat so that life may survive. 5, 6. Both the Epic of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis are preceded by the similar Sumerian creation myth, c. 1600 BCE. 7. The oldest surviving example of such a flood myth narrative known from tablets found in the ruins of Nippur in the late 1890s and translated by Assyriologist Arno Pobel. 8. George Smith, who discovered and translated Epic of Gilgamesh. Academic U. Samuel Chen. 9. Analyzed various texts from the Early Dynastic III period through to the Old Babylonian period, and argues that flood narrative was only added in texts written during the Old Babylonian period. With regard to the Sumerian king list, observations by experts have always indicated that the portion of the Sumerian king list or king about before the flood differs stylistically from the king list proper. Essentially, Old Babylonian copies tend to represent a tradition of before the flood apart from the actual king list, whereas the Ur III copy of the king list and the duplicate from the Brockman collection indicate that the king list proper once existed independent of mention of the flood and the tradition of before the flood. Essentially, Chen gives evidence to prove that section of before the flood and references to the flood in the Sumerian king list were all later additions added in during the Old Babylonian period, as the Sumerian king list went through updates and edits. Flood as a watershed in early history of the world was probably a new historiographical concept emerging in the Mesopotamian literary traditions. During the Old Babylonian period, as evident by the fact that the flood motif did not show up in the Ur-II copy and that earliest chronographical sources related to the flood show up in the Old Babylonian period. Chen also concludes that the name of Ziusudra as a flood hero and the idea of the flood hinted at by Thatnam in the Old Babylonian version of instructions of Shuruppak are only developments during that Old Babylonian period, when also the didactic text was updated with information from the burgeoning antediluvian tradition. 10. In the Hebrew Genesis, the god Yahweh, who had created man out of the dust of the ground, 11, decides to flood the earth because of the corrupted state of mankind. Yahweh then gives the protagonist, Noah, instructions to build an ark in order to preserve human and animal life. When the ark is completed, Noah, his family, and representatives of all the animals of the earth are called upon to enter the ark. When the destructive flood begins, all life outside of the ark perishes. After the waters recede, all those aboard the ark disembark and have Yahweh as promise that he will never judge the earth with a flood again. Yahweh caused a rainbow to form as the sign of this promise. 12. In Hindu mythology, Texts such as the Satapatha Brahmana, 13, c. 6th century BCE, 14, and the Puranas contain the story of a great flood, Manvantara Sundoye, 15, 16, wherein the Matsya avatar of the Vishnu warns the first man, Manu, of the impending flood, and also advises him to build a giant boat. 17, 18, 19, in Zoroastrian Mazdaism, Ahriman tries to destroy the world with a drought, which Mithra ends by shooting an arrow into a rock, from which a flood springs. One man survives in an ark with his cattle. 20. Norbert Ettinger argues that the story of Yuma and the Vara was originally a flood myth, and the harsh winter ways added in due to the dry nature of eastern Iran, as flood myths did not have as much of an effect as harsh winters. He has argued that the mention of melted water flowing in Vidvdad 2.24 is a remnant of the flood myth, and mentions that the Indian flood myths originally had their protagonist as Yama, but it was changed to Manu later. 21. In Plato's Timaeus, written c. 360 BCE, Timaeus describes a flood myth similar to the earlier versions. In it the bronze race of humans angers the high god Zeus with their constant warring. Zeus decides to punish humanity with a flood. The titan Prometheus, who had created humans from clay, tells the secret plan to Deucalion, advising him to build an ark in order to be saved. After 9 nights and days, the water starts receding and the ark lands on a mountain. 22. The Cheyenne, a North American Great Plains tribe, believe in a flood which altered the course of their history, perhaps occurring in the Missouri River Valley. 23. Historicity. Floods in the wake of the last glacial period, c. 115,000 c. 11,700 years ago, are speculated to have inspired myths that survive to this day. 24. Plato's allegory of Atlantis is set over 9,000 years before his time, leading some scholars to suggest that a Stone Age society which lived close to the Mediterranean Sea could have been wiped out by the rising sea level, an event which could have served as the basis for the story. 25. Archaeologist Bruce Mass stated that some of the narratives of a great flood discovered in many cultures around the world may be linked to an oceanic asteroid impact that occurred between Africa and Antarctica around the time of a solar eclipse, that caused a tsunami. 26. Among the 175 myths he analyzed were a Hindu myth speaking of an alignment of the 5 planets at the time, and a Chinese story linking the flood end of the reign of Empress Nuwa. 14 flood myths refer to a full solar eclipse. 27. According to Mass, these indications point to the date the 10th of May, 2807 BC. 28. His hypothesis suggests that a meteor or comet crashed into the Indian Ocean around 300–2800 BCE, and created the 30-kilometer, 19-mi, undersea Burckle crater and Finambosi chevron, and generated a giant tsunami that flooded coastlands. 29. Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, like other early sites of riverine civilization, was flood-prone, and for those experiencing valley-wide inundations, flooding could destroy the whole of their known world. 30. According to the excavation report of the 1930s excavation at Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, Iraq, the Jemdut Naz and early dynastic layers at the site were separated by a 60-centimeter yellow layer of alluvial sand and clay, indicating a flood. 31. Like that created by river avulsion, a process common in the Tigris Euphrates river system. Similar layers have been recorded at other sites as well, all dating to different periods, which would be consistent with the nature of river avulsions. 32. Shuruppak in Mesopotamian legend was the city of Utanapishtim, the king who built a boat to survive the coming flood. The alluvial layer dates from around 2900 BC. 33. Earth's sea level rose dramatically in the millennia after the last glacial maximum. The geography of the Mesopotamian area changed considerably with the filling of the Persian Gulf after sea waters rose following the last glacial period. Global sea levels were about 120 m, 390 feet, lower around 18,000 BP and rose until 8,000 BP when they reached current levels, which are now an average 40 m, 130 feet, above the floor of the Gulf, which was a huge, 800 kilometers 200 kilometer 500 mi 120 mi, low-lying and fertile region in Mesopotamia, in which human habitation is thought to have been strong around the Gulf oasis for 100,000 years. A sudden increase in settlements above the present-day water level is recorded at around 7,500 BP. 34, 35, Mediterranean Basin. The historian Adrian Mayer theorized that global flood stories may have been inspired by ancient observations of seashells and fish fossils in inland and mountain areas. The ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and Romans all documented the discovery of such remains in such locations. The Greeks hypothesized that Earth had been covered by water on several occasions, citing the seashells and fish fossils found on mountain tops as evidence of this idea. 36. Speculation regarding the Deucalion myth has postulated a large tsunami in the Mediterranean Sea, caused by the Thra eruption, with an approximate geological date of 1630-1600 BCE, as the myth's historical basis. Although the tsunami hit the South Aegean Sea and Crete, it did not affect cities in the mainland of Greece, such as Mycenae, Athens, and Thebes, which continued to prosper, indicating that it had a local rather than a region-wide effect. 37. Black Sea Deluge Hypothesis. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis offers a controversial account of long-term flooding. The hypothesis argues for a catastrophic eruption of water about 5,600 BCE from the Mediterranean Sea into the Black Sea Basin. This has become the subject of considerable discussion. 38, 39. The Younger Dryas Impacts hypothesis offered another proposed natural explanation for flood myths. However, this idea was similarly controversial. 40, and has now been refuted. 41. Comets. Painting from 1840 depicting a comet causing the Great Flood. The Eve of the Deluge, by John Martin, 1840. Depicts a comet causing the Great Flood. 42. The earliest known hypothesis about a comet that had a widespread effect on human populations can be attributed to Edmund Halley, who in 1694 suggested that a worldwide flood had been the result of a near miss by a comet. 43, 44. The issue was taken up in more detail by William Whiston, a protege of and popularizer of the theories of Isaac Newton, who argued in his book A New Theory of Earth, 1696, that a comet encounter was the probable cause of biblical flood of Noah in 2342 BCE. 45. Whiston also attributed the origins of the atmosphere and other significant changes in the Earth to the effects of comets. 46. In Pierre Simon Laplace's book Exposition du Système du Monde, The System of the World, first published in 1796, he stated sad smiley 47, he greater part of men and animals drowned in a universal deluge, or destroyed by the violence of the shock given to the terrestrial globe, whole species destroyed, all the monuments of human industry reversed. Such are the disasters which a shock of a comet would produce. 48, 49. A similar hypothesis was popularized by Minnesota Congressman and pseudo-archaeology writer Ignatius L. Donnelly in his book Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel, 1883, which followed his better-known book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, 1882. In Ragnarok, Donnelly argued that an enormous comet struck the Earth around 6000 BCE to 9000 BCE, destroying an advanced civilization on the lost continent of Atlantis. Donnelly, following others before him, attributed the biblical flood to this event, which he hypothesized had also resulted in catastrophic fires and climate change. Shortly after the publication of Ragnarok, one commenter noted, Whiston ascertained that the deluge of Noah came from Akome's tale, but Donnelly has outdone Whiston, for he has shown that our planet has suffered not only from a cometary flood, but from cometary fire, and a cometary rain of stones. 52. Art. Matsya Avatara of Lord Vishnu pulls Manu's boat after having defeated the demon. Matsya Avatara of Lord Vishnu pulls Manu's boat after having defeated the demon. Nanabajo Inajidwe flood story from an illustration by Osiyama, in his book North American Indian Fairy Tales, Folklore and Legends, 1905. Nanabajo Inajidwe flood story from an illustration by Osiyama, in his book North American Indian Fairy Tales, Folklore and Legends, 1905. The Great Flood, by anonymous painter, the Vamrath Bequest, Rijksmuseum. The Great Flood, by anonymous painter, the Vamrath Bequest, Rijksmuseum. The Deluge, by Francis Danby, 1840. Oil on Canvas. Tate Gallery. The Deluge, by Francis Danby, 1840. Oil on Canvas. Tate Gallery. Noah's Ark from the Zugdat al-Tawarik in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts in Istanbul, dedicated to Sultan Murad III in 1583. Noah's Ark from the Zugdat al-Tawarik in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts in Istanbul, dedicated to Sultan Murad III in 1583. See also Mythology Portalican, Religion Portalbling Alad Warming, List of flood myths, Sea level rise. References.